Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Hummus for Thought, the podcast. This is Sarah Hunaidi. I am a Syrian person, writer, whatever, living in Chicago at the moment, and with me...
And my name is Joey Ayoub, and I'm also a Lebanese person / writer, currently living in Edinburgh, Scotland. So let's get right into it. So the topic that we're discussing today is the personal as political, and this is something that I feel many people would inherently understand, and many other people might, have some difficulties understanding it. And we started talking about this. I mean, we have talked about this for quite some time, but we spoke about this especially in the past few days because of something that happened to you. And I was wondering if you can kind of tell everyone what that is.
Yeah, so a couple of days ago, I had an encounter with a professor at my university, and as you know, I am a Syrian refugee who witnessed the uprising from day one. And basically what happened is that professor was explaining to me that the whole uprising that changed my life and a lot of people's lives, and basically was the turning point for our lives and a rebirth, is a lie. And I think that it's important to note here that I couldn't not think of who he is and who I am, because this encounter happened after the class. The class, by the way, is supposed to be about social movements in the 20th and 21st century. And the reason why I talked to him afterwards is that because I wanted to do academic research on the Syrian uprising as a movement. And I needed his help with that. Supposedly he is my professor and he's supposed to help me with that. So it was kind of upsetting to me sitting there being my whole existence, my whole experience is completely ignored because he was explaining to me that the Syrian uprising is basically a lie, or kind of telling me that I am delusional. Because he read an article and he kept repeating that I read an article and it made sense to me, and I do not believe anything that the mainstream media in the US reports. And he was coming from a point of view that we should all be critical of everything that the mainstream media reports and supports. And the mainstream media in the US seems to be supportive of the Syrian uprising and the Syrian revolution, in a way, as he is saying. And he just doesn't buy it. And even my whole experience, my whole existence, basically, he's delivering a message, an unspoken message, that no matter what you say, this is my stance, and because I read an article. And I couldn't help but analyze my reaction, his point of view. I kind of had an out-of-body experience, in that encounter. And Joey, I remember the first thing you said to me was that this is insulting to you. And I had no idea. I did not even think about it. And it's very important here to note how our trauma kind of, when discussing politics, we can't really separate the traumatic outcomes of politics and politics itself when we actually try to say, oh, we're just being objective here. And in reality, there's no objectivity, because politics affect people's life. It affects people's trauma. It has many dimensions. It's personal. It's not this thing, the abstract thing that we talk about in academia and in the news and whatever. And when you told me it's insulting, it kind of took me 2 to 3 days to kind of actually absorb it and repeat what happened over and over again. So yeah, it's a deeply personal thing, like you pointed out, actually.
Yeah, so that's what's interesting, is that it was more obvious to me at the time, as soon as you told me that story, than it was immediately to you. And obviously that's because of the relative privilege that I have in, taking some distance from things, and obviously because I know you, and I know your story, and I'm, relatively well read on what's been happening in Syria. Also because, I got used to these type of responses that um, have become so common, uh, to the point where I sometimes forget that they're still there, because it's this weird thing where we have, me and you, and you with other people and me with other people, we've talked about this. We've talked about how just across the border, supposedly anyway, when it comes to Palestine, many Western academics, leftists, anti-imperialists, whichever terms people like to use these days, don't seem to have that big of a block in their mind. So it's a relatively simple story. They're even willing to, go the extra mile and analyze things with some level of nuance or something like that. They can even say things like, "We support the Palestinian cause without supporting Hamas or Fatah." And they can even say these things, and these things make complete sense. But you just cross the border and you say the exact same thing, that this is actually what happened. And Syria, the Syrian revolution and subsequent civil, and you can call them regional wars at this point, are arguably the most documented quote unquote conflict in the history of humanity, because it's the first real um, uprising and again subsequent conflict that was almost every single day was documented, and is still being documented because of social media. And the irony is that instead of producing a situation where things are very clear, and they cannot get clearer than that, it's almost that the relative simplicity of the narrative, the fact that this is what happened, especially in 2011, 2012, in the early phases of the mostly non-violent uprising and so on. This is actually what happened. People actually went to the streets. It started slowly, and then there was this sort of snowball effect, and people started becoming more confident. And the crackdown was what people are telling you it is. It was this brutal. It was actual massacres and actual bombings and actual shellings and tanks and shabiha and all of these things. And it's almost like the fact that it's that easy, it's that obvious, then therefore there must be something else. And the thing is that you want to get, like, I've had this time and time again, and it's obviously much easier for me than it is for me, because again I have the privilege, because I'm not Syrian, of having this relative taking a step back sort of thing.
Distance.
Yeah, sort of distance. And so I can, it's just this it's become so difficult. I mean, it has been difficult for quite some time. It's nothing new. It's been at least a few years now, where you want to tell the person in front of you, well, yeah, it is very complicated right now, and there are lots of things to take into consideration, but we sort of need to agree on the basic facts here. And if we don't agree on the basic facts, then we're gonna have a like the whole notion of native agency, of Syrian agency. If you erase that, then you're just not talking about the same thing.
Exactly. And it's not so hard right now, like you said, to see the mess that's like, and to look at it from like a macro level of like macro powers, Russia against the US, like trying to seize control or whatever. It's not so hard to see right now what is actually hurtful to the Syrian people and to someone like me, okay, is that the dismissing of the actual start of the revolution, of this movement. I'm not sure even if I should call it a movement, because I do kind of admit that it wasn't well thought out. It was a revolution. It's something erupted in us, and it's not like we took our time to actually organize and think about it. And it's actually one of the criticism of the revolution by many intellectuals in Syria, which is somehow not, I don't forgive it that much, because there was no space for us to organize. We didn't have this luxury to organize and actually think it out, this revolution. It had to happen this way, unfortunately. But this dismissing of the whole experience and how it started and why it started is what actually kind of hurts like it doesn't play well against the Syrian trauma, the collective trauma, on a personal level and on a collective also level. That's one. Second is just basically lies, you know. This is not how it happened. You're kind of changing history. You're changing a whole narrative of a whole people. And you don't get to do that as an outsider. This is also, you have to also look at the power dynamic in that conversation that I had with my professor. He's a professor, I'm a student, so I already have this power dynamic of respect, of like, I'm supposed to learn from him. But at the same time, he did not live through the revolution. He did not witness it. He's a middle-aged white man living his whole life in the US. And I am a refugee, and he's telling me how it all happened. And I'm not against that. I'm here to learn. I'm here to learn from him. I was telling him, I need you to help me to become a better writer and to write about this thing that I witnessed, but not in a storytelling type of way only, because that's what I have been doing all these years. I want to get more into the academia of it. I want to do real research. And to my surprise, his reaction was very dismissing of me, also, as he kept interrupting me whenever I tried to say anything. To be honest, not all the time, but also there's like a gender part of it. He was, as we say now, literally white-splaining and mansplaining to me. Something I have lived personally, and it's affecting my whole life. I don't like to use this word, but I was exiled because of it, or actually kind of, I was displaced. I don't mean to like put something, exile something is a word that has a lot of other meanings, but I was displaced because of it, and I'm here because of it. So you can't just dismiss a whole experience by someone who does not fit the, let's say, the power dynamic that you belong to, like as a middle-aged white well-educated man. You have to, in the US kind of, or in the West in general, I don't know, you may speak more about Europe than I do because I haven't been there, but there's a lot of dismissing here of our experience. Also, there are a lot of panels that happen also to talk about Syria with no Syrians in it, for example. And this is something deeply personal. It's not just discussing politics. You're discussing people's lives here. Politics is personal. And this elitist way of looking into politics as an abstract thing is, in my opinion, is extremely, extremely wrong and hurtful.
Yeah, you touched upon something that's very important, I guess. It's the notion of politics as an abstraction. And the irony, like the what really adds insult to injury is that we are in 2018 and there are still folks who, again, if they wanted to, they don't, like, the irony is that they don't even need to know Arabic, because again, a lot of the testimonies, the overwhelming majority of things that have been reported were done also in English, or at least were translated into English. So there's really no excuse in the age of the internet to not know at least the basic facts.
Yeah.
And what you said about the early days of the revolution and how it wasn't planned, I mean, yeah, I mean that's the thing. It's revolutions are supposed to be inconvenient. There's no such thing as you know, this is going to happen and this is how it's going to happen, and if it happens in any other form, if it takes any other form, if anything diverts from this pure vision that we have of how things are or how things should be, then you know, me, the entitled person who has not lived through a revolution, who has not lived through war, who has not been forced to leave his or her home, you know, almost dismissing that. And this does play into the exact same narrative that other forces right now in the West are thriving on. Like, this is something that, for me, I really try and, as much as I can, emphasize that there is genuinely absolutely no difference between a typical quote-unquote leftist anti-imperialist and a typical quote-unquote far-right fascist when it comes to Syria. In terms of the actual politics of things, in many ways, I honestly say this, and I don't mean this in a sarcastic way. I genuinely say that when fascists speak about Syria, they are more honest about it. They just tell us directly, we support Bashar Assad, we don't care what he does, he is our hero, he is whatever, he is this and this and this. And there's no argument there because they don't care about the argument. That's not the point of fascism. It's not here to discuss with you. But when this takes the form of leftists who, in other circumstances, would say that they stand in solidarity with Palestinians against Zionist aggression, or they stand in solidarity with this or that people or this people, it really made me like I learned it the hard way, that when they say, when these people, the same people who would say I support Palestine, and then when it comes to Syria there's always 1,000 yeah but, and you know, all of these things, is that, oh, then you're not actually supporting Palestinians, then this is actually about you, because in your mind this is a conflict that you can understand. And it's not the fact that they are struggling or they're under occupation or that this or this or this. No, it's really the fact that you understand it, or you think you understand it anyway. And that is enough. So if you get to the point where you're talking about Syria, where you had to at least, just for barely a few moments, a few minutes of your time, think, well, what if I'm wrong? What if this time something is happening? We're talking about 2011 here, like 7 years ago. And well, maybe I, who is not a Syrian and who doesn't speak Arabic, I'm not me, but me, the Westerner in this case, who doesn't speak Arabic, who hasn't been to Syria, who's probably never met any Syrian in my life, well, you know, something is happening, and if I want to say, that's the thing, if that person, if that Western leftist, whatever, wants to say, I X supports struggles against oppression, then that actually means something. Because that actually means that, well, you need to do your research then. You need to actually stop, like shut up and listen for once. And just that alone is apparently such a endeavor. Like, it takes so much. And I have good friends now who now tell me quite honestly, that Westerners who, like, they were that just up until a few years ago, when, you know, they met a Syrian refugee, or they stumble upon some book or some article that kind of changed their mind or whatever, and now they look back on this past self of them and they feel disgusted, not just ashamed. You know, they feel like, how did I actually manage to actually, I would be insulting and adding insult to injury to Syrians who are literally fleeing for their lives at that point, like in 2013 or 2014, for example. And not just, I would kind of ease my guilt by saying, well, I'm pro-refugees, so I'm okay with them coming here. But I'm not okay with asking, well, why are they fleeing in the first place? And that because the pro-refugee thing for me is kind of a cop-out.
Yeah.
Because you as a leftist, you don't get cookie points for being pro-refugees. Like, that's not something that you should kind of, you don't get points for this. That's what's expected of you. That's what you're supposed to be doing. The next step is to actually talk to these refugees and ask them, well, why are you fleeing? And if you don't have opportunity to talk, well, you can read again the internet. Every single major poll that has ever been done, and I've done thorough research on this because I was in a situation where I had to kind of back up my arguments with actual statistics and polls and stuff. Everyone, from those interviewed in Germany to those interviewed in Sweden to those interviewed in the UK, in the US, whatever, the vast majority of them say that they are fleeing the regime. And that makes sense. It's a state. It's a government. They have the monopoly on power. That's how states function. No one is gonna go in the context of the United States and start arguing that there is any equivalent between an oppressed people in the United States and the police force or the army or the whatever. There is no comparison. We're not dealing with Syrians, who even those who took up arms, they never had a navy and they never had an air force. And again, you cross the border, you go to Palestine, and this is clear and this is obvious. During the bombing in 2014 in Gaza, I was covering the conflict. Again, I don't even like to call it a conflict. I was covering the war on Gaza, on civilians by Israel, for Global Voices, and I would get barrages, lots and lots of comments and whatever by pro-Israel apologists who would be saying the exact same thing. Like, literally, it's unbelievably, it's extraordinary how similar they sound, as many Western, pro-Assad apologists sound. Literally the same things from, well, at least the regime is secular. Well, at least Israel is secular. Well, Islamists. Oh, well, Jaish al-Islam, Hamas. Well, this, well, that, well, this, well, that. And you keep on having to say time and time again, okay, I hate Hamas. I hate Jaish al-Islam. That's still not the point. That's not what I'm telling you here. Again, it's the fact that you go back to the problem that you are not even on the same level when you're talking about the facts, because the person in front of you simply is not acknowledging reality. As simple as that. One of the main things that we try and say in the Palestinian cause is that this is not a conflict by the definition of two equal sides fighting each other. There are no two equal sides. Even if you put all of the armed Palestinians together, they are nothing compared to Israel, and no one would deny that. Israel gets billions in dollars of tax-funded money, U.S. taxpayers' money, the most sophisticated weaponry on the planet. They essentially test their weapons on civilians, and then they get to sell them in arms exhibitions and that sort of stuff, arms fairs and that sort of stuff. And you come and tell me that photographer or that protester yesterday who was shot down by a sniper is as strong as the sniper? This is not something that you can tell me. It doesn't make sense objectively. Even if you don't want to admit or whatever, you just can't deny reality. And when you look at the videos, again, if you're not Syrian, you still have at least access to the videos and the images and the massive amount of documentation by international and local human rights organizations, and obviously by activists who the only thing that they could do at the time was literally take up their phones and film what's going on and then upload it on YouTube or Facebook, or both. You still have access to those. They're still there. Some of them are being deleted by YouTube and Facebook, unfortunately, but still the overwhelming majority of them are still there. And you can see what's going on. And now we have books being written and being published in English and documentaries being, produced with actual footage. These are not CGI, whatever. Bashar or one of his MPs used to say that these are studios in Qatar and that sort of crap. This is the level of discussion that we're talking about. You're either telling me that the hundreds and thousands and millions of people who were taking videos were all produced in some studio in Qatar, or you're telling me that you are actually accepting reality, and you cannot have it both ways.
Yes, and if you look at it also from, since we are interacting in like a Western type of environment, for someone like me and like you, it's very such a colonial mentality to tell someone who is not white European what is best for them, and what what happened to them or what they witnessed does not matter. What matters is what you think about what happened to them. So it's such a colonial mentality, and it's really ironic that it comes from the left, who actually preach day and night about how different they are and how progressive they are. And that professor, when he was telling me about mainstream media, he always says, and there's this huge notion in the left that I see right now, is that everything that the American government and the mainstream media in the US supports, everything that they support is the opposite of that is true. So, and they claim that it's critical thinking. They claim that this is a rebellious act, but critical thinking is actually to check your resources, to ask people, to actually be critical, not to say, okay, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This is not how it works. This is not how politics works. This is not how academia is supposed to be either. Like, coming from a professor is really broke my heart. I was like, oh my God, I'm not sure if I want to learn in this institute or from this person in particular. This is not the type of education that I actually keeps me sane. This is how I cope with my trauma, is that, okay, I'm here, I exist in the US to get the type of education that will help me in the future, help my country. So to be faced with this type of rhetoric is really problematic. And it's also, again, like the thing that you pointed out is it's insulting, because again, the colonial mentality does not admit that the people who are in front of them are actually well educated enough to speak for themselves. They always want to speak for them. This is why they always explain to us our life, explain to us what we need, explain to us how we should be governed, and how we should think, or how we should whatever, which is, it's extremely problematic coming from people who actually claim to be progressive and like thinking out of the box, which is, to me, it's completely inside the box actually. And it hurts us more than, like you said, there's no difference between someone in the far right and someone who thinks like that. It does the same damage to our cause, for me personally, as a Syrian refugee and as a supporter of the Syrian revolution from day one. So it's just completely problematic, and on a personal level and on a macro level, because it translates into this very failed politics in the US, for example, regarding Syria, and in the world, like the West in general have failed. And I mean, I'm not claiming to know the answers of how to solve the Syrian problem, but what we have been seeing right now is a complete and utter failure to our cause, and we are the ones who are dealing with the consequences. We are the ones who are losing people. We're the ones who are being displaced. We're the ones who are basically dealing with all the mess that's been going on. And again, I'm not claiming to know the answer, but come on, I'm a 22-year-old who has just learned English 4 years ago, and I can see how messy this is. And world leaders who are supposedly well educated and are the experts in their fields are making these types of mistakes, and the people on the left who are, again, supposedly usually support movements and freedoms and all these labels are, again, not supporting our cause and actually hurting it by questioning the roots of it. So questioning its whole legitimacy. It's kind of like even me, I can I can see how messed up it is. So it's, again, it's completely personal. It's not this, if it's messy on the, in academia and in politics, and like when it's abstract, imagine how messy it is on a personal level, to each and every refugee and Syrian and person. So
I completely agree, and obviously like to go back again to the idea that if we're not agreeing on the basic facts, then not only are we adding insult to injury, but we're also wasting a lot of time here, and time that we already don't have. So the thing when we talk about the geopolitics of things is that I sort of forced myself to read as much as I can, educate myself as much as I can, just because I got used to hearing those types of responses. And at some point in the past now, I really took it upon myself to be able to debunk them and deconstruct them in the hope that it makes some difference. And maybe it does in the long term. But what they don't understand is that they're not actually, that's the whole irony of it, is that they're not actually opposing their government here. The US government has not been pro-regime change in several years now. You can argue at least since the red line, the famous, infamous red line of Obama in 2013, when it was violated by Bashar in Eastern Ghouta. And you can argue even further back, because the irony is that the Iraq scenario has been the main fear of Obama. As in what would happen to Syria if the state collapses in the same way as, you know, what we the Americans did in Iraq in 2003. And the irony is that these leftists were actually agreeing with Obama here. The main role that the United States did when it comes to the geopolitics of it, and again, this is not my opinion, this is, you know, I wish it was different, this is not a point of view, this is a fact. The main role of the United States, arguably anyway, is to block certain types of weapons from reaching the rebels in the early years. And one of the conditions to get weaponry, certain types of weaponry, is if these rebels say pledge that they would not touch the regime and that they would focus, and by that time we already had Daesh, that they would focus their efforts on Daesh. People don't understand that rebels at the time, again, I'm speaking about the early years in 2012, 2013, up until 2014 even, they were already fighting extremists on the ground. That was already the thing, because it was the natural demand of people. The FSA conducted a gigantic campaign, I forgot which year, I'm bad with dates, sorry, but again, these people can look them up, to root out Daesh from certain parts of Syria. And this was happening without any actual help. And in fact, one of the main difficulties that they had was actually maintaining these positions, because they were at the same time fighting the regime, and the regime at the time was not touching Daesh. It was focusing completely on the FSA, because the whole point, and it's incredible to me that it's still not that obvious, that if you are Bashar al-Assad or him and his surroundings, what you want to be able to show is that the alternative to me are those extremists, Islamists, etc. So it's in your best interest, you as the dictator, to eradicate everyone else. That's why in 2011 he released all those Islamist prisoners, including Allouj from Jaish al-Islam and others. And I forgot the name of the guy who became head of Sham. While he was, eradicating, annihilating civil dissent in any shape or form, mass rape campaign, mass forced disappearance campaign, mass torture campaign. We discovered up to 13,000 hanged in Sinai prison alone. You know, mass extermination campaigns, while at the same time bombing every single ounce of a democratic secular opposition, whether armed or especially non-armed, because that has always been the biggest fear of the regime, bombing local councils, bombing revolutionary coordination committees. It blows my mind, honestly, that we're still at the point where it's not that obvious that if you are a regime which, by the way, again, sorry to bring back to how They don't understand that they are not opposing the US government. Bashar al-Assad was one of the regimes that where the United States could outsource torture during Bush's war on terror. The infamous story of Maher Arar, who's a Syrian Canadian, who to this day he still cannot go to the United States because the United States never apologized to him or recognized what they did. They kidnapped him essentially and sent him via Amman to Damascus to be tortured by Bashar al-Assad's regime on behalf of the CIA. And then I tell these people, do you have any idea what you're talking about? The same regime, you go back to Hafiz, invaded my country in 1976 to crush the PLO and the leftist resistance. And at the time, you read any leftist writing at the time, and they were seeing what was happening. The regime was on the side of the right-wing coalition, as it's always been. That has always been its point. The whole notion that as soon all that matters is that they call themselves socialist or anti-Zionist or anti-imperialist, and the narrative matters more than the actual facts. There is a reason why people like Yassin Haj Saleh were imprisoned, because he was a communist, because he was on the left and opposed to the regime. The only quote-unquote leftists who were tolerated were those who did not want to challenge the regime. So these people on the left, and that's why I'm not gonna say I have more respect. I don't have respect for any of these people, but I just recognize that the far right is just much more honest about it. They tell us they want these communists, these leftists, these Democrats, these whatever. They want them crushed because they are happy with they see in Bashar as Ziad Majid, the Lebanese socialist intellectual, and I believe Yassin Haj Saleh also mentioned this point. They see Bashar as essentially their white savior. And you look at far-right quote-unquote activists in the West, like David Duke from the KKK, who visited Bashar like 10 times a decade ago, and now like you see his Twitter timeline, he's in love with Bashar. What's that guy's name? I forgot these guys. Like any fascist activist that you can Google, they really tell you openly, we support the regime and this is why we support the regime. And for leftists who see the side of the far right, they remember the Charlottesville when you had the Unite the Right rally. The day before, there were many of these fascists who had T-shirts of Bashar al-Assad.
Yes.
And they were telling reporters to their faces, we love this guy. And leftists, this is a year and a half ago, I forgot when it was, like over a year ago or something. And to this day, there are still leftists who still don't get that they are on the side of fascism. It's just all of the sign, as it's really got to the point where you have no excuses. If you're someone who actually tells me, or much more importantly, tells a Syrian that you oppose imperialism and oppression and fascism and authoritarianism and whatever, and you actually are endorsing all of those, the worst combination you can think of at the same time, I'm sorry, something's very wrong here. What you're telling me is simply, it doesn't fit with the facts.
Also, like, just to play the devil's advocate right here, because someone can just say right now that, well, a lot of Islamists support the revolution, the Syrian revolution, and they chant freedom, and then in reality they want an Islamic state. We're not here trying to say that just because fascists support Assad, that Assad is good. This is not the evidence. That Assad is a dictator. Assad is a real dictator. Talk to an actual Syrian who is not a fascist, who is not... well, I don't know what are the criteria, but just as Joey was just saying, there are a lot of evidence right now. But what I'm saying is that this same argument is used also against the revolution now, because again of Islamists and someone like Jaish al-Islam and a lot of other armies that are just are coming out of nowhere and fighting each other and actually hurting the cause more than anyone else. But this is not the reason why the revolution is started, and it's not because of Islamists, it's not because of extremists, and this is not why Assad is a dictator, not because he is backed by fascists, because he is a fascist, because he has a record over 50 years of fascism, of blocking free speech, of torturing people, innocent people. Someone like Yassine al-Haj Saleh got into prison when he was 19. And he stayed there until he was in his 30s. He stayed there for 16 years, basically. And he's an example of many people. What we're saying here is that there's a lot of evidence that the Assad regime has been a fascist for years, and it's not really hard to see. And it's after, maybe before, it was before the revolution, it was kind of disagreeing or like, we can disagree, but now when you sit in front of a refugee and you start to question or legitimize the actual reason of why the revolution started, it becomes personal. It's not a disagreement anymore. It's something that people are losing their lives over, and people who, by the way, might have not even thought of the revolution. They didn't maybe even support it. These are civilians who maybe are farmers or just are practically were apolitical. They do not care. They just want to have a normal life. I'm not talking about someone who is. I was interested in politics, and I wasn't before, but when the revolution started, I became interested in politics, like many people. But some people it did not move them, and they have totally different, how do I say this, kind of, all they want is just a normal life. And these are the people who are being attacked and who are becoming the victims, mostly. And it's just more personal than we actually like to admit. This is the whole point. And going into like, I think politics, and I don't care if this is gendered coming from a woman who is like, emotions are really important, but I don't really give a damn at this point, because I really think that politics lacks emotional intelligence. It's not there anymore. When we talk about politics, we do not understand that we're talking about people, that we're talking about people's lives, that we're talking about people who want education, people who are now homeless, people who are now shunned from their families. For example, women, we have a whole history of women who supported the revolution, and now they have been shunned from their family and their community because a woman is not supposed to be basically have her own opinions or whatever, or even women are seen as the honor of the family or whatever. So this is something that a lot of women have lost. Their own families have lost custody over the children. This is something This is something personal anymore. It's not just politics or like we are disagreeing on different opinions. And when you told me about the insult, and I want to also like talk about more how our collective trauma is translated into our political life when in power dynamic, because we are emotionally invested in this, obviously, and in academia sometimes it's seen as a weakness when you are invested in something emotionally. You're supposed to be you have a distance. You're supposed to be apathetic to it, which is something also I totally disagree with. I agree that you should have a distance to anything so you can look at it from many points of view, but that does not mean that you should be a robot or you should be dismissing of people's experiences, because you'll just... This is actually like... It scares me because it's... When we talk about this, we actually want academics or politicians to be sociopaths, to not have any feelings, which is really scary, right? In order to be human, you have to look at people's experiences and to acknowledge their pain and their trauma, and to even sometimes let yourself feel it, this vulnerability, because the majority of people do not have the power to actually choose their destinies, and this is what democracy is all about, right? For the majority of people to have the power over their own destinies. So this emotional intelligence that is lacking in politics is making the political world really a disgusting place, in my opinion. In any, literally everywhere, in academia also, in political academia or academia that discusses politics. And you yourself, you had an interaction the other day that you were telling me about in the train, I believe, when you identified with someone in the news or something. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so it was the next day after Brexit, and I was living in London back then, and I was already a bit active in the local sense. So I did know a bit about British politics before moving to London to do my masters, and then staying there for a couple of years. But obviously, when I went there, things changed, and I became even more active, and and so on. Point is that it was the day after Brexit, and obviously London voted mostly to stay in the EU. So the mood around London was you can kind of feel the tension. People were either shocked or depressed or anxious, or just a combination of these things. So I was going somewhere, I don't remember where, but I took the underground from King's Cross, and I was going somewhere. And I sat on the tube, and I usually I would listen to music on the iPod or something. And there was a guy in front of me, an elderly chap in his, I don't know, late 50s, early 60s or something. And he was reading the Daily Mail. I'm trying to remember if it was the day after Brexit or the day after Brexit. It doesn't matter. It's like very soon after Brexit. And it's one of those headlines of the Daily Mail that, you can probably just Google and find like hundreds of those of, migrants swarming, or, migrants invading Britain, or, that sort of stuff. And on the headline, you just had huge, like, bold headline stuff, but then you had the photo if I remember correctly, it was probably like men, migrants, behind some lorry, some big truck or something like that, like trying to get into the UK via France or something like that. And I just had this, you described as an out of body experience. I guess it's sort of that. It's just a realization, in a sense, that the men on that headline look like me. It's this very, very weird thing to be put in a position, because it's one of those microaggressions. I mean, I don't even know if it's micro, to be honest. It's one of those daily violent acts that are part of the structure in a country like the UK, since we're taking the UK as an example. And it just made me realize that, I mean, that could have been me. That could have been me if something happened to me, or if I was desperate enough to flee my home, or if whatever, and I had to find the exact same, go through the exact same route as many Syrian refugees ended up going through, the boats, and then via Turkey, Greece, whatever. That could have actually been me on that headline. And if it wasn't that big of a leap to think about. I mean, Lebanon has 15 years of civil war that ended when I was born. Like, I was born right after the war. Obviously, 2006, the war between Hezbollah and Israel, which honestly I would describe as Israel's war on civilians, like in Gaza. The Lebanese have been refugees. I mean, quite a huge part of our history. If you look at Kurds or Armenians Or if you look at, other Lebanese who left and then came back, or left and never came back, or whatever, pretty much most of our population has fled. We have more Lebanese or people of Lebanese descent outside of Lebanon than inside of Lebanon. My point is that it's not that inconceivable that in the near future, unfortunately, given the way things are, especially with Israel, that if, or honestly, when there's going to be a war with Israel again, I don't know if things are gonna be that bad that some people are gonna find themselves desperate enough to also try the boat route, or go maybe via Syria north to Turkey and then make their way to Europe or whatever. And that would be us. Like for me as a Lebanese, it's like it's this double. It's two ironies at the same time. One, as a Lebanese, it was one of those things that when I left Lebanon, I mean, when I was in Lebanon, I was, pro refugees and supporting refugee rights and and opposing xenophobia, all of these things. But it really took for me to leave and to be put in this position where, well, at least theoretically, that could have been me. And, not that unrealistically in the near future, that might be me. I don't know. Or at least someone that I know, or some of my friends who don't have as good connections like me, or have less money, or who are Palestinians and therefore don't have the good papers or whatever. So it made me realize how bad things are back home. So in Lebanon, that was one, because we were forgetting something that we went through very recently. Many Syrians, welcomed Lebanese in 2006. It's not that long ago. Uh, and at the same time, on the other level, being in the UK now, being a de facto migrant, because that status, you don't really know how it's applied. Because if I could, with the visa situations, I might be a migrant. Right now, I'm officially a student, but I'm also trying to find a way to get a job or to do whatever. So, some people would just see me as another migrant. So I was on both sides at the same time. In Lebanon, I am my relatives, my neighbors, not my friends, but my neighbors, my relatives, people I interact with, would be part of the oppressor class, and then they travel just a few kilometers across the Mediterranean Sea to go to Europe, and they might be among those who want to keep the refugees out. As the Lebanese French diaspora is, many of them would be on the far right, unfortunately. They are essentially that. They are those who became refugees, were naturalized and in quote unquote integrated, and now because they feel that they're part of whatever, whiteness, Frenchness, whatever, that they want to keep the other refugees out. And it's this sort of, it's a very, very sad assessment to make, because it essentially means that facts on their own don't matter. And what matters is whether you were forced to, in my case, for example, I was forced to face reality. That was one on lots of levels that I just mentioned. Or you have good friends who are politically aware and whatever, and they introduce you to new ideas. Or you meet someone like a refugee who went through something, basically like almost coincidences. Or really like it has to go back to the individual to make the basic sort of efforts, which these days is much easier than it ever was because of the internet. We hear lots of these stories during the Second World War. Well, did the masses know about what was happening in the camps, in the extermination camps in Auschwitz, etc. And we actually learned that actually they did know. They may not have always known exactly everything that was going on, but the fact that Jews and Poles and Russians and others were being sent to the death camps, that, or at least to places, at the time it wasn't a secret. You cannot hide something like this.
Yeah.
And yet there was overwhelming complacency and complicity. So I don't know. It's kind of a cliche as
and it still used the same rhetoric that they didn't know, and now we know, and nothing really changed. And if what you're saying is true, also that they also knew, nothing's changed either. So it's kind of, it's really dark to look at it from this point of view of like, what's the difference then of activism, right? It kind of makes you question a lot of things.
I mean, that's the thing. And for those who don't want to go back to World War II, well, don't. You can stick to the 90s and think of the breakup of Yugoslavia and the Bosnian genocide and lots of other atrocities where, in the Bosnian case, I'm sorry, we knew what was happening. You know? We knew. Things were not that hidden. There were things, lots of things were clear. You know, certain warlords and war criminals were saying things out loud. And at the time, by the way, because one of the reasons why it really moved me to see during the fall of Aleppo in the end of 2016, so many Bosnians in Sarajevo were having a vigil and protest to basically tell Syrians, we know what you're going through, and that was essentially the message, and that some of the signs were saying this and stuff, and that's because no two situations are the same. There are always differences, obviously, but fundamentally they were being left alone, and they were left alone, and that feeling of being left alone. And at the time, by the way, the left was not that clean either, unfortunately. It just poses lots of questions. And to go back to the point of the the personal as political, people who have the privilege of separating the two should be the ones who really also question, what does it mean that I, X, can, if I want to separate the two? Because there are lots of people, and you can argue the majority of the people on the planet basically don't have that choice. The notion of separating the political from the personal. When I was sitting on the tube, and for me that's still a minor example compared to some of the other stuff we're talking about, but that's my experience sitting on the tube and seeing this. I mean, that sort of ruined my day. Like I didn't want to. I'm not supposed to be forced to think about things like that, because the man in front of me who's reading this, no one is forcing him to think about these things. And in fact, the whole backlash of, oh, political correctness has gone too far or whatever. What they don't realize is that, well, actually, no, it hasn't gone too far. Nothing has ever gone too far, other than the fact that that's how bad things are. You just didn't realize it. And the Brexit as a small example, Trump as a bigger example, I guess. It's really that. It's a matter of. I mean, I've been in those situations. I was sitting down with someone who is really pro Brexit or whatever, and trying to rationalize things with me. That person fundamentally had to use a certain framework that did not fit reality. The framework had nothing to do with the actual facts on the ground. They were not economic arguments or political, if you want to say, arguments. They had nothing to do with anything. Like, the person would be telling me, well, actually, I have nothing against migrants, but this is too much, for example. And then I ask him, okay, then what is the limit? Where is the not too much? What does it mean? What are you talking about? And obviously, no one knows the answer, because they are not forced to answer that question. And despite the fact that their decisions by voting this or supporting that or whatever will affect other people who don't have any choice, the people who have a choice are also complaining about the fact that they are being criticized, or they are being told, hey, ask yourselves a few questions here, because even if you're not certain, that's fine. You don't have to have all the answers. But please don't be certain about something if that something can actually harm other people and you're not thinking about it. So yeah, it just made me think again of the whole, because again, I think we can just go back in circles and find even more examples of how the person is political. And then we ask ourselves this question all the time, and then what is the personal? Like, at what point can I just be me and have my own thoughts and my own arguments and my own politics and my own whatever, without that being defined by things that I cannot control, like my quote-unquote race or my origins or whatever, or for other folks, their gender or their sexual orientation or gender identity, things that are personal should quote unquote not necessarily be political if you don't want to. But you're put in it more often than not. People who are in those situations don't have that choice in the first place, because they are constantly having to
Exactly.
to defend themselves.
I had also another professor who used to say that there is no truth. Truth is just a word we say. There's actually no facts. That everything is so subjective, and it depends on from where you look at it, which is, again, I can't help but see that only people who are privileged enough can say this thing. Who are already immune enough can say these things. And the reality is, nobody wants to, okay, not nobody, maybe some people want, but I do not want to be defined by my race, by my country, by even my political views. I don't really care. I don't want to be defined at all, okay? Because this definition is going to lead to discrimination one way or another. And of course, I am opposed to discrimination, and no one deserves this discrimination. But you can't say that race and privilege does not exist just because you don't want them to exist. Basically, also that professor who was telling me that at the end, after I told him that, but I saw this and I witnessed that, and I was there when everything was happening. You can't tell me it was a lie. And at the end, he just looked at me, and in a very honest moment, he said, well, if that's the case, then that's a tragedy. That's a tragedy. I do not want to look at it that way, because I want to look at it from a macro level, because it makes sense. He kept repeating, it makes sense. But if what you're saying is true, actually, it must be a tragedy for you and for the world, for our ethics and for Mabarif. He just started to telling me how hurtful it is if actually what I witnessed is real, if the revolution is actually something that happened with the will of people. And I'm not saying the majority, by the way. I admit that I have a lot of people who were opposing to the revolution from the start. I'm not saying, it's an overwhelming majority of people in Syria wanted a regime change and wanted the overthrow of Assad. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it's a revolution, it's an idea, it's a movement that happened, and some people do not want to believe it because they do not want to feel this tragedy of how it actually turned out to be. The same thing with race. They do not want to see race because it hurts to see race, maybe, I don't know. But again, if you don't want to see privilege, is because you have the privilege to not see privilege. It's really, it's like going on in circles, but it's the truth, because someone who is black, who is a woman, cannot not see racial privilege, and a woman cannot not see gender privilege, because we have to live with it every single day. And I know it's hurtful, but imagine if you come closer to realizing how hurtful it is, you just run away from it, and we have to live with this essentially trauma every single day. And it still shocks us until today. I mean, you did not know what to do the other day when you saw this thing. It caught you off guard, because you lost your sense of safety, right? You felt like, I'm not safe in the world. Same thing with me. I did not realize of how insulting it was. I was actually trying to, I talked to you and I was like, I'm gonna stay in this class. I want to prove to him with evidence that the Syrian revolution happened, blah, blah, blah. I was trying my best, going out of my way, not paying attention to to the trauma, to like the emotional draining that it'll cause me, just because to prove to the world that, oh, we actually suffered, or we are actually suffering, please see us. Maybe it's not even our job anymore. Maybe we should not do this to prove to someone. We should only write stories and work on our narrative, not to prove to someone who refuses to see our collective trauma, but maybe to heal, for to do this for our own healing, you know, our own selves, our own building of the future or whatever. But to keep trying to prove to a world that, or to someone that doesn't want to see or is scared to feel the trauma that we literally go through every day, I think is inevitable. It's draining on a personal level, and it won't get us anywhere on a macro level as people, and in politics as well. So yeah, hopeful stuff.
It reminds me of I forgot where it was. I think it was in Kafran Balenciaga or something. One of those signs they would put every week. It was something like apologies for the inconvenience, but this is a revolution. And I feel like it kind of summarized the whole point. Is that, I'm sorry, like, you know,
exactly.
No offense, you know, no offense meant, but you know, this is what's happening, and you can either choose to please look at what's happening, or, as many unfortunately have done, pretend that nothing is happening, or, you know, go even worse and try and make excuses for it.
Yes, and I believe in people's voices. I believe in people's opinions, and I do not believe that, a lot of people will use the counter argument is that what we're saying right now, like to talk to actual people and to try to make them see what we go through is like doesn't pay because they're not the people who are making the decisions. But again, politics does not work like that. There are no like gods working and then there's no this separation of people. What we do in public translates into politics, and what we think also translates into politics. And we see that of the type of leaders we see, actually, of how like sexist they are, because we refuse to be because there's a huge misogyny in the world that we refuse to actually address. And then we're like, it won't affect us, but then we elect someone into office who is very sexist, and then we see that progressive useful laws for women are abolished or not there anymore. So I believe that activism actually works, and this is why we're doing all this work. This is why we write, this is why we talk, this is why it's not useless. This is my opinion, and I know yours too.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so yes, we're ending this is the first episode, and that's why it was a bit longer, and because we basically told ourselves that we'll just go with it. You know, we have our theme and we're going to discuss something. But in the coming weeks and, you know, months, and hopefully longer than that, we're going to have other people as well. We're going to speak with interesting folks, Syrians, Lebanese, Palestinians, others, about lots and lots of topics. And I will write all of this down on the website, on the blog. And we are definitely going to have many more of these interesting conversations and include lots of interesting people in it as well.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for a great conversation, Joey.
Thank you, Sarah.
Bye.